The scent of roasted turkey filled every corner of the house, seeping through the air like an old memory that wouldn't fade. The golden bird sat at the center of the table, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, and freshly baked rolls. Candles flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the smiling faces gathered around. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, about gratitude, but for me, it had begun to feel more like an annual test of how long I could hide the truth. Ethan, my son, sat at the head of the table, his broad shoulders and confident posture mirroring his father when he was younger. His wife, Amanda, was busy making sure the kids didn't spill juice on the tablecloth. And his two little ones, Emma and Liam, were giggling at the funny shapes they made with their mashed potatoes. I watched them all with a quiet smile, my hands folded neatly in my lap. It had been a long time since I'd hosted Thanksgiving myself. After my husband passed, Ethan insisted they take over the tradition. "You've done enough, Mom," he'd said. "You should just relax and enjoy the holidays." It was a kind gesture back then, but somewhere along the years, the warmth of it began to fade. Each year, I felt a little less like family and more like a guest sitting on borrowed time. The table buzzed with laughter and conversation. Amanda's parents were there too, chatting about their recent cruise to the Bahamas. They always seemed so effortlessly well off, with their designer clothes and polished smiles. I sipped my water quietly, trying not to let the feeling of distance sink too deep. Ethan looked at me suddenly and smiled. "Mum, you've been awfully quiet tonight. Everything okay?" "Oh yes, sweetheart," I said, smiling softly, "just enjoying being with everyone. The food is wonderful, Ball." Amanda smiled politely. "Thank you. I followed Grandma's recipe for the stuffing this year." "It's delicious," I replied, though my voice was smaller than I intended. For a while, everything felt almost perfect. The laughter, the warmth, the stories. But beneath my calm expression, a storm was brewing. My bills were stacked high back home on the kitchen counter. The electric company had sent another shut-off notice last week, and the gas bill was overdue again. I'd been skipping meals to stretch my pension. It wasn't pride that kept me from asking for help. It was fear. Fear that I'd be seen as a burden. But tonight, I couldn't avoid it any longer. My account balance was nearly zero, and the cold weather was already creeping in. I waited until the table's chatter softened, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ethan," I began gently, my voice just above a whisper. "Sweetheart, I hate to ask, but could I borrow a little money? Just enough to get through the month. I'll pay you back as soon as I—" The sound of his fork dropping onto his plate cut through my sentence like glass shattering. "Mom," he said, his tone sharp, almost impatient. "Can we not do this right now?" The air around the table grew thick. I felt every eye turn toward me. "I'm sorry," I murmured quickly, heat rising to my cheeks. "I didn't mean." He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "You've got to stop asking for money, Mom. It's embarrassing." The words hit harder than any slap could have. Embarrassing. The same mouth that once called me supermom now said I was an embarrassment. The laughter that once filled my heart was replaced by silence, so heavy it pressed on my chest. Amanda's mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing away. Amanda herself reached out to touch Ethan's arm, as if to calm him. But she didn't look at me. The kids stared down at their plates, wide-eyed and confused. I didn't mean to make a scene," I said softly, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My hands trembled under the table. "I just thought, never mind, sweetheart. It's fine." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Mom, I love you, but you've got to stop this. You can't keep asking me for money every few months. You've got your pension, right?" My mouth went dry. I nodded weakly, even though that pension barely covered rent. "Wes," I lied. "Of course." He exhaled, relieved, and picked up his fork again, as if the conversation were already forgotten. The room remained quiet for a few long seconds before Amanda's father cleared his throat and changed the subject. "So, Ethan, how's work going these days?" "Oh great," Ethan said, instantly brightening. "Actually, I just got approved for a new project. Big deal at the firm. Probably the biggest in my career so far." Everyone congratulated him. Laughter returned. The moment was erased for them, but not for me. My heart was still sitting in that silence. My throat felt tight, my chest hollow. I stared down at my plate, the turkey and stuffing blurring through a veil of unshed tears. I forced myself to eat, to pretend, to smile when someone looked my way. But inside, all I could hear was that word, repeating like a cruel echo, embarrassing. I had once carried that boy in my arms through sleepless nights, through fevers and heartbreaks. I worked double shifts just to afford his textbooks, skipped meals so he could eat, and took out loans to help him finish college. Every dream he had, I'd built a piece of it with my sacrifices. And tonight, all of it came down to that one word, embarrassing. When dessert came, I excused myself quietly. "Just going to get some air," I said, though no one protested or followed. I slipped my coat on and stepped out into the cold night. The air outside bit at my skin, sharp and cold, but it was still kinder than the air inside. I walked slowly down the front steps and across the driveway, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me. My old car sat under the dim streetlight, frost forming along the edges of the windshield. I sat inside and shut the door, the silence wrapping around me. My hands trembled as I started the engine, just to feel the warmth. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than I remembered. Lines deeper, eyes duller. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out at the glowing windows of Ethan's house. Inside, they were probably laughing again, moving on from that awkward moment, filling their plates with pie. He wouldn't think about what he said. He wouldn't understand how it felt. And how could he? He didn't know that for the past 4 years, I had been quietly paying off his 30,000 credit card debt. It started back when he was 22. Fresh out of college, newly married, and already drowning in expenses. He had called me crying one night, saying he couldn't keep up, that he was being harassed by collectors. "Mom, I don't know what to do," he'd said. His voice had been so desperate, so broken, I couldn't bear it. So, I told him not to worry. I said I'd take care of it. I called the credit card company, worked out a payment plan, and began sending monthly checks. I didn't tell him because I knew his pride wouldn't let him accept it. He wanted to feel capable, successful, and I wanted to protect him from shame, from stress, from the same struggles I'd endured after his father died. Every month since, I'd paid quietly, sometimes late, sometimes barely enough, but I always found a way. I worked odd cleaning jobs, sold jewelry, and skipped meals to make it happen. I watched my savings drain bit by bit, but I never regretted it. Until now. Now, sitting alone in that car under the cold November sky, I felt something inside me crumble. I had sacrificed so much for him. Everything, really, and he had no idea. Tears filled my eyes, hot and blinding. I pressed my palms against my face and let them fall. I wasn't angry, not really. I was heartbroken. Heartbroken that love could be so easily mistaken for weakness. That the same son I'd once held close now looked at me with embarrassment instead of gratitude. The sound of laughter floated faintly from the house, muffled by the glass and distance. I thought about going back in, pretending nothing had happened, but I couldn't. My pride, what little of it was left, wouldn't let me. So, I started the car and drove home in silence. The roads were empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the tears had dried, leaving only exhaustion. I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkened windows of my little house. Inside, the air was cold. The heater had stopped working again. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat at the kitchen table, where the stack of unpaid bills waited like an accusation. My eyes fell on the folder I kept in the drawer. The one with all the receipts. Every payment I'd made toward Ethan's debt. I pulled it out, flipping through each slip, each confirmation, each hard-earned dollar that had gone to him. $30,000. 4 years of struggle. And not once had I asked for anything in return. I traced my finger along one of the receipts. The ink slightly faded from age. For a brief moment, I remembered his smile when he told me he'd finally paid off all his debts. He had been so proud. I had smiled, too, and said, "I'm proud of you, son." I never told him the truth. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have let him carry that burden instead of me. The clock ticked softly in the background, each sound echoing in the stillness. I thought about the word he'd used. Embarrassing. And realized it wasn't me he was ashamed of. It was what I represented. A reminder that beneath his success, there was still the mother who had built the foundation he stood on. I sat there until the candles on the counter burned down to nothing. And in that silence, I made a quiet decision. This would be the last time I ever asked him for anything. From now on, the debt between us, emotional or financial, was over. He didn't owe me money, he owed me understanding. And maybe one day, he'd realize just how much love it took for a mother to carry her child's burden in secret. Until the weight of it nearly broke her. It had started with a phone call, one I still remembered as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Ethan had been 22, newly married, and trying to find his footing in the world. I was in the kitchen that evening, washing dishes after dinner, when the phone rang. His voice came through the line trembling. "Mum, I messed up," he said. "I don't know what to do." At first, I thought something terrible had happened. An accident, a fight, maybe a job loss. But when he explained, my heart sank for a different reason. He'd been using credit cards to stay afloat while trying to build a new life. Rent, wedding expenses, furniture, car repairs. It had all added up. Now the bills were due, the interest was piling high, and the collectors were calling nonstop. "Mom, I'm drowning," he said. And I could hear the fear in his voice. "I can't tell Amanda. She doesn't know how bad it is." I leaned against the counter, gripping the phone tightly. "How much are we talking about, sweetheart?" He hesitated before answering. "Around 30,000. The number hit me like a punch. $30,000. It wasn't something I could just pull out of thin air. Especially not then. I had just retired early after losing his father. The pension was modest, barely enough for my mortgage and groceries. But when your child is crying on the other end of the line, logic doesn't matter. Love does. "Don't worry, Ethan," I said softly, trying to steady my voice. "We'll figure this out." And I did. The next morning, I called the credit card company. They were surprised to hear from me. But after explaining that I was his mother, and wanted to help settle the debt, they agreed to let me handle the payments directly. I set up a plan. Monthly payments that, if I was careful, I could manage. It meant cutting corners. It meant saying goodbye to the little luxuries that made life bearable. But I didn't care. Ethan was my only son, my whole world. At first, it felt right. I'd mail the checks every month and mark the payments in a small notebook I kept in my drawer. I didn't tell him, because I knew he'd be ashamed. He'd always wanted to stand on his own 2 feet. And I didn't want to take that from him. I wanted him to believe he had overcome the challenge himself, to keep his pride intact. I told myself it was temporary. Maybe 6 months, a year at most. But 6 months became a year, and a year turned into 4. The payments were steady but slow. Every time I thought I'd made progress, interest would creep back in, eating away at what I'd accomplished. Still, I kept going. When my savings ran thin, I picked up part-time work. I cleaned houses during the week, and watched a neighbor's children on weekends. My hands, already worn from years of work, grew rougher. My knees ached from scrubbing floors, but when I dropped those envelopes into the mailbox each month, I felt a quiet sense of purpose. I never told Ethan. He'd call sometimes, chatting happily about his job, his vacations, his new home. "Mum, you should see the kitchen," he'd say once. "Granite countertops. You'd love it." I'd smile through the phone. "That's wonderful, dear. You've worked so hard, you deserve it." And I meant it. But deep down, a small H lingered. A quiet hope that one day he'd ask about me. Ask how I was managing. He never did. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with bills spread out before me, trying to stretch every dollar. The pension barely covered essentials, and after I made Ethan's payments, there was little left. I learned to go without things. I canceled cable, stopped buying new clothes, and even started skipping my medication some months to save money. I'd eat toast for dinner, pretending it was enough. There were moments of weakness. Nights when I questioned if I was doing the right thing. But then I'd remember that phone call, his voice shaking, and I'd tell myself it was worth it. Mothers don't stop caring when their children grow up. They just find quieter ways to love them. Years passed, and slowly, the debt disappeared. The day I made the final payment, I stood at the mailbox for a long time before letting the last envelope go. It was done. $30,000. Gone. My savings were nearly wiped out, my body exhausted, but I felt a strange peace. Ethan was free. He would never know what it cost me. But that didn't matter. It was enough that he had a clean slate. When I told him the good news, pretending it was his accomplishment, he was overjoyed. "Mom, I did it," he said. "Finally paid it all off." I smiled, my throat tight. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," I said. "I knew you could do it." He didn't notice the pause before I said it. He didn't see the tears in my eyes. Over the next few years, I tried to rebuild my finances, but it was difficult. My part-time work had slowed, and my savings were gone. I sold some jewelry, including my wedding ring, to cover bills. It hurt, but I told myself it was just a ring. Memories lived in the heart, not on the finger. Meanwhile, Ethan's life seemed to bloom. Promotions, new cars, family vacations. I saw the photos online sometimes. Smiles in front of beaches, happy kids, matching outfits. I'd leave little hearts on the pictures, but he rarely replied. He was busy, I told myself. That's what happens when your children grow up. They have lives of their own. Still, a small part of me missed the boy who used to call me every week, just to ask what I was cooking for dinner. The boy who once said, "Mom, when I make it big, I'll take care of you." That promise had long faded into memory. The weeks leading up to this year's Thanksgiving had been particularly hard. The heating bill had nearly doubled, and my pension wasn't keeping up. The savings account was down to its last few $100s. I'd already pawned my last gold bracelet. I didn't want to ask for help, but the cold was creeping in, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. When Thanksgiving arrived, I put on my best dress, an old floral one I'd worn to Ethan's graduation years ago, and tried to smile. The drive to his house felt longer than usual, though the distance hadn't changed. His neighborhood was so beautiful now. Rows of new houses, manicured lawns, and shiny cars parked in driveways. I remember thinking how proud I was of him for making it here. But underneath that pride, there was fear. Fear that, maybe he'd forgotten who had helped him get here. And when the moment came, when I finally asked for a little help, it felt like stepping off a cliff. I hadn't planned to say it in front of everyone, it just slipped out. The weight of everything, the bills, the loneliness, the years of sacrifice, pushed the words out before I could stop them. And his reaction, I still couldn't erase it from my mind. The look on his face, the way his voice tightened with irritation. "Stop asking for money." He didn't say it quietly either. He said it like I'd done something shameful. Afterward, when I drove home that night, the humiliation sat in my chest like a stone. I replayed the moment over and over, asking myself what I had done to deserve that. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew the truth. He'd grown past me. I wasn't part of his world anymore. Just a reminder of a time he wanted to forget. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table again. The folder with all the receipts was still there, tucked neatly inside the drawer. I pulled it out, opened it, and began flipping through the papers one by one. Each page told a story he'd never know. There were notes scribbled on some of them. Worked double shift this week. Skipped doctor appointment to save money. Paid late, but they accepted. I ran my fingers across the faded ink, feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness. I had done all of this to protect him, to keep him from struggling, and yet here I was, alone, cold and broke. The irony wasn't lost on me. For a moment, I wondered what he'd say if he knew. Would he apologize? Would he feel guilty? Or would he brush it off? Say he never asked me to do it? That thought hurt most of all, because he'd be right. He never asked. I chose to do it. But isn't that what love is? Choosing, even when it hurts. I poured myself a cup of tea, though I could barely taste it. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the cup. The house was so quiet it almost echoed. I thought about the years of silence between us. The missed birthdays, the brief phone calls, the polite but distant conversations. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being his mother, and started being a background character in his life. I set the cup down, and stared at the stack of papers again. For the first time, I felt something different, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Resentment. Not just because of what he'd said at dinner, but because of what it revealed. I had spent years protecting him from pain, shielding him from consequences, and in doing so, I had erased my own worth. I had made myself small so he could stand tall. I loved him more than life itself. But I realized that love, without boundaries, had turned into sacrifice without recognition. I leaned back in my chair, the folder still open, and whispered to the empty room. You'll know someday. Ethan. You'll know. The clock ticked softly in the background. The night stretched long and cold. But somewhere deep inside me, a new kind of warmth began to stir. Not the warmth of love, but the strength of truth waiting to be told. And for the first time in years, I began to think that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop protecting him. 2 days later, I woke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. The sky outside was gray, the kind of soft, colorless morning that made the world feel quiet and small. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the pile of papers still spread across my dresser. The receipts, the check stubs, the payment confirmations. Every scrap of proof that I had spent the last 4 years paying off Ethan's $30,000 in debt. I hadn't been able to sleep much since Thanksgiving. His words replayed in my mind like an endless echo. Stop asking for money. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and feel my chest tighten as situation were happening all over again. I wanted to forget, to let it go, but the H was too deep. There are wounds that time can't heal until truth is spoken aloud. As I stared at the papers, I knew what I had to do. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to embarrass him or make him feel the way I had felt at that dinner table. But he needed to know. Not for me. For him, because if I didn't tell him, he would continue living in a world where love could be taken for granted, where sacrifice went unseen. I gathered everything carefully into a brown envelope. I didn't write a letter. I didn't need to. Every paper inside told the story better than I ever could. I put on my coat, tied my scarf, and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. The rain falling in a steady whisper against the pavement. The drive to his house felt longer than usual. The roads were slick, the trees bare, their branches reaching like fingers across the gray sky. I tried to steady my hands on the wheel, but they trembled anyway. A part of me wanted to turn back, to tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need to do this. But something inside kept pushing me forward. When I pulled into his driveway, I sat there for a while, engine running, wipers brushing away the rain. Through the front window, I could see the faint glow of light, the silhouettes of movement. Amanda passing by, Ethan standing near the hallway. It looked warm in there. Happy. I hesitated, clutching the envelope in my lap, and whispered softly, "Please, God, help me find the right words." I stepped out and walked to the door. My shoes splashed through small puddles. When I rang the bell, I could hear footsteps approaching. Ethan opened the door, surprised to see me. "Mum, what are you doing here? It's freezing out," he said, concern flickering briefly across his face. "I won't stay long," I replied softly. I held out the envelope. "I just came to drop this off." He frowned. "What is it?" "Something you should see," I said. My voice trembled slightly, but I stood tall. "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart." Before he could ask anything else, I turned and walked back toward the car. "Mom, wait," he called after me, but I didn't stop. The rain had started to fall harder now, each drop cold against my face. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. When I reached home, the house felt colder than usual. I changed out of my wet clothes, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The envelope was gone from my hands, but the weight of it still lingered in my chest. I didn't know how he would react. Maybe he'd be angry. Maybe he'd feel guilty. Maybe he'd ignore it altogether. But whatever happened, the truth was finally out. It was almost evening when my phone started ringing. I didn't pick up. The screen lit up again. "Ethan." I turned the phone face down on the table. Then again. Finally, on the fourth call, I answered. "Mom." His voice cracked through the line, raw and unsteady. "Mom, what is this?" "These papers. You paid off my credit cards. $30,000. I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said quietly. "I did." "Why?" His voice broke. "Why would you do that and not tell me? I could have handled it, I could have." "No. Ethan," I interrupted gently. "You couldn't not then. You were scared. You called me crying, remember? You said you didn't know what to do. And well, I'm your mother. I wasn't going to let you drown." "But Mom, that was years ago. You should have told me. You shouldn't have done that for me." "I didn't do it for you, sweetheart," I said. "I did it because of you. Because I couldn't stand to see you suffer. That's what mothers do." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, heavy and uneven. Then he whispered, "I told you to stop asking for money." His voice cracked on the last word. "God, Mom, I told you to stop asking for money. And you were paying my debt the whole time." Tears burned in my eyes, but I kept my voice calm. "Yes, you did say that, but don't worry about it now. Don't worry about it," he said, almost shouting. "How can I not? You've been struggling all this time, haven't you? And I didn't even know. I thought you were fine. He stopped, his breath hitching. "Mom, why didn't you tell me when you needed help?" "Because I didn't want you to feel guilty," I whispered. "You had your own life, your own family. I didn't want to burden you. But you already were burdened. You were carrying me." I smiled sadly. "That's what being a mother means, Ethan. Carrying you even when you don't see it. Loving you quietly, even when it hurts." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard him crying, not soft tears, real heavy sobs, the kind of crying that comes when guilt meets love. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said gently. I don't want you to feel bad. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I love you. Please," he whispered, "please let me make it right. I'll pay you back. Every cent. I promise." I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. "No, Ethan. That's not what this is about. You don't owe me money." "But I do," he insisted. "I owe you everything." "No," I said again, this time firmly. "You don't. What you owe me is something far more important. You owe me understanding, respect. Maybe next time, Before you speak in anger, you'll remember the things you can't see. The sacrifices people make for you quietly. He was silent again. I could almost hear him trying to find the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. I don't deserve you, Mom. I took a deep breath. You're my son. You don't have to deserve me. You just have to understand me. We talked for a long time after that. Longer than we had in years. He told me about work, about the kids, about how he'd been so caught up in trying to prove himself that he hadn't realized how far he'd drifted. I listened quietly, feeling something inside me begin to heal. Before hanging up, he said softly, Mom, can I come over tomorrow? I just want to see you. I smiled through the tears. Of course, sweetheart, I'll make tea. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, letting the silence settle again. The house still felt cold, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not by the world, not even by my family, but by the one person who had needed to see me most. That night, I slept deeply, peacefully. When I woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, golden and warm. The storm had passed. Ethan arrived around noon. He didn't come empty-handed. He brought flowers, groceries, and a nervous smile. When I opened the door, he didn't say anything. He just hugged me. For a long time. I'm sorry, he whispered into my shoulder. For everything. I patted his back gently. It's okay, darling. We're okay. We sat in the kitchen afterward, drinking tea, the air soft between us. He asked about the bills, the house, my health. Questions he hadn't asked in years. He offered to help, to take care of the things I'd been struggling with. But I told him not to worry. Just come visit more often, I said. That's worth more than anything. As he smiled, I realized something I hadn't before. The moment at Thanksgiving had broken something in me. But it had also broken something in him. And from that break, something new had begun to grow. Understanding, empathy, connection. Before he left, he walked around the house, fixing little things. The leaky faucet, the creaky door hinge, the loose light switch. When he came back to the kitchen, he looked at me and said, You shouldn't have had to do all that alone, Mom. I smiled gently. Sometimes, being alone teaches us how strong we really are. He nodded, eyes glistening. Still, I want to be here now. For you. That night, after he left, I sat by the window again, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The light spilled across the sky in shades of orange and pink. Soft and quiet. I thought about the years I had spent hiding the truth, the sacrifices I had made, and the pain of that Thanksgiving dinner. But now, sitting there with a heart lighter than it had been in years, I realized something profound. Love, when it's pure, always finds its way back. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes pain. But it returns. As the day faded into night, I whispered a small prayer of gratitude. Not for money, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Because after all those years of silence, my son finally saw me. Not as a burden, not as an embarrassment, but as what I had always been, a mother who loved him more than anything. And that was enough.